Anytime you're switching mediums in art class, you will want to complete one of these new media test sheets. I usually have a lot of these available. So if you're switching from acrylic paint to watercolor or colored pencil to marker, anytime you need to test out a new medium, this is the way to do that. And also, if you are switching from, say, one brand of acrylic to a different brand, you might want to complete this so you can see how they perform differently. So this should be the first one that you do. We will be using the Saks heavy-bodied acrylic. You're going to need red, yellow, blue, white, and black, 2 water cups, about half full, a sheet of butcher paper to mix your paint on, a medium-sized flat brush, some paper toweling, and it's also very handy if you have a palette knife for mixing your paint. It's better to use a palette knife than a brush for mixing. You'll want about this much of each of the primary colors. And then you can see I've got the black and white set off a little bit because we won't need those until later. So just starting with the 3 primary colors, we will be mixing all of our other colors. The first thing you want to do with this sheet is get your name and the date and the product written on it so you know what you're dealing with. Okay, my name, the date, and like I said, we're using the Saks heavy body acrylic. It makes a difference because we have different types of acrylic in the art room, and this one definitely performs differently than those. So the first thing we're going to do is start with our primary colors. Those are the colors that you can't make by mixing. They just come this color straight out of the ground and straight out of the paint tube. So everywhere it says red, we're going to fill with red. So that square, this one, and also over here. Remember to condition your brush, which is just putting some water on it. You don't want to keep a whole lot of excess water, so dab it off. And then when you go to get acrylic paint, you just want to dip the bristles in about that far. That's plenty of paint for what you need to do. You don't want to get the paint up there into the ferrule. It's really bad for it. So we're just going to go ahead and fill in everything that says red. Okay, I've got all my red squares filled in. Now I can move on to the yellow. It's worth noting that the red that comes out of that bottle, this particular brand, isn't a really true red. It's actually a bit darker. It's actually going over into the blue to purple zone. And that's exactly the reason why we test out these paints when we get them, because even straight out of the bottle, a primary color may not be a true primary color. And so when you go to mix it, it's going to produce different results. When you rinse your brush, it's a good idea to have the 2 water cups so you can get the majority of your paint off. The majority should go onto your palette, like you just saw me scrape it on there. Then you rinse in 1 cup, get it as clean as you can, and then rinse in another. And you'll see that when I rinse my brush, I push it down against the bottom of the glass to kind of splay out the bristles gently. And then that gets the water into all the bristles and gets it clean. And then dry off any excess water. And we can move on to the yellow portion, which will be here, 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 and here. Okay, there's my yellow filled in there. I think this particular brand of yellow is pretty close to a color wheel yellow. The thing with these types of paints is sometimes they have a warm or cool tone to them. So that red might be a cool red, which means it goes more to blue, versus a warm red, which would be moving more towards the orange or yellow spectrum. It's one of the reasons we do this warm to cool scale, which is basically just the rainbow. So you can see the colors all lined up next to each other, and you can determine just how warm or cool they are in comparison. Okay, now we will do the blue. Okay, here's our blue filled in all of the blue spots. Now it's time to do the secondary colors, and secondary, of course, means the second level of color. So we get orange by mixing red and yellow. We get green by mixing blue and yellow. We get violet by mixing red and blue. So we need to mix all of those from the pigment that we have, put them in the secondary squares, find their space on the color wheel, and also find their place in the warm to cool spectrum and on the other side of this complementary opposites section. Orange is the first color that is on our sheet. So what you should do for orange is take a little bit of this yellow, and then we're going to start adding red, a very small amount at a time. Almost always throughout different brands of paint, the red is going to have stronger pigmentation than the yellow, so it'll overtake it really quickly. So we're going to mix it, we're going to look at our color compared to the color wheel, and then we're just going to keep adding small amounts of red until we get the color that most closely matches the color wheel. Sometimes you're not going to be able to match it perfectly. You just have to get it close enough. Like I said, if this red is not a true red, that's definitely going to affect how well you can make orange. So I'm going to go ahead and continue mixing this off camera until I get something that looks like my color wheel orange, and then we will check on that. Okay, here's my mixed orange, and I think that it is pretty close to the color wheel orange. So we're going to go ahead and apply that to our test sheet. You want to make sure you have a good little amount, because we're actually going to use this in more than one place. So that's probably a good amount to have right there. Okay, orange is in the orange places, in the secondary, in the spectrum, right between red and yellow, and then on this spot opposite blue. Now I will go ahead and mix the green. Green is very challenging to mix. You can very seldomly get the actual green of the color wheel, but get it as close as you can. Just like mixing orange, when you're mixing green, you want to start with your weaker pigment. In this case, it will be yellow again. And then add very small amounts of blue until you get the color you want. In almost every brand of paint, blue is going to be your strongest pigment of all. It just tends to be very concentrated and very powerful. Okay, here's the green I came up with. I think it's actually more towards yellow-green according to this color wheel. But here's the thing, I think their green is a little bit blue-green on this color wheel, so I'm going to stick with this shade. A true green is kind of an unappetizing color. It's like a Kelly or a shamrock green. It's not very pretty, I don't think, until you start adding other colors to it. So I think that this is pretty close to the green I want. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this into all the places that it goes on my color chart. Here's all my greens right there in secondary, right between blue and yellow on the wheel, here on the spectrum, and opposite red for the complementary opposites. I will get the violet mixed up and put that in. And then we will talk about this indigo spot right here. I have the violet mixed. I started with the red and just added small amounts of blue till I got to this point. It's hard to see violet on your palette, but I think this is pretty close to violet on the color wheel. The thing about this color of violet is it's almost an artificial color like you would see in grape candy or grape Kool-Aid. If you want to make sure that you've got this color absolutely right, there is an area on your test sheet right here that says swatches. And all this is for is just for you to test out your colors. So this would be a good place to test out this purple color so we can get it kind of spread across the paper and see if it's the color that we're looking for. And I think it is. That looks really close to me. It's really easy to go a little too blue or a little too red with violet, so mix it carefully. I think this is good, so I will put it into all the violet places on my test sheet. Okay, there's my violet. Finishing up my secondary squares there. Violet right between red and blue. Violet on the warm to cool spectrum. And right here across from yellow. So we still have this indigo to deal with, and then we have our tertiary colors. Tertiary meaning 3, so 1, 2. 3s are going to go in here. So we're going to do a red orange, a yellow orange, a yellow green, a blue green, a blue violet, and a red violet. Probably your initial water cup is getting pretty dirty at this point. So let's change that, and then we'll come back and we'll deal with this little indigo guy. Okay, indigo is not actually on the color wheel. So if it were, it would be right around here, somewhere between blue and blue violet. Indigo is included here because it is part of the visible light spectrum. When you learn about the rainbow in grade school, you might have learned the acronym Roy G. Biv. It's like a guy's name, and it stands for red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. So indigo is part of the visible light spectrum. It just doesn't fit neatly into our color wheel. So it's included here, but it's not necessarily going to show up here. And the way you get indigo is you're just going to take your basic blue and you're going to add a very small amount of violet to it. What indigo is just a dark blue. It's actually the color of blue jeans. They use the indigo plant to dye denim to make blue jeans. So we want it a little bit darker than this primary blue, but we don't want it to actually go all the way to blue violet. That's a little bit too purple. So again, we're going for something right in between those two. Okay, I think what I've got here is a nice dark indigo. I'm going to test it in my swatch space just to see what it looks like when it hits the paper. Okay, so you can see that's definitely darker than my blue, but it's not quite over into purple yet. So I think that's a good indigo, and I will put that into my indigo square. Okay, to fill in my tertiary colors, I'm just going to take the primary colors that I've got on my palette and mix in those secondary colors. You can see that my palette is starting to get a little bit full. If you want to get a fresh piece of paper for this, you can certainly do that. So I will probably start with the orange and add a little bit of yellow to that to get my yellow orange. Here's my yellow orange, and I think that is pretty accurate. So I'm going to go ahead and add that to my color wheel. Okay, and there is my yellow orange, right between yellow and orange. Now here's kind of a neat thing. I need to make a red orange, but I used up all of my orange to mix that yellow orange. That's okay. You can go from yellow orange to red orange just by adding enough red. So this is yellow orange right now. As I add red, it's going to turn back into plain orange. Okay, this color of orange right here. And then as I keep adding red, it will shift over into this red-orange zone. So you can take your yellow-orange and just keep adding red until it's the shade that you want. Here I am back at orange, so I'm just gonna keep adding red. Actually, before I do that, and you should do this too, I want you to take just a little bit of that orange and you're going to reserve it. So put that somewhere because we're going to be using that again. So I should still have enough here for my little experiment, and I will just keep mixing this till I get to where I need to be. Okay, I believe I have achieved red-orange. That's looking pretty close to me. So we're going to put that in the color wheel right here between red and orange. That's the only place that we'll need that. There is my red-orange. I also swatched it down here just because I thought it was a really nice color. There's also a spot right here where you can indicate what the color is, or even, you know, some kind of little formula for how you mixed it. I did like blue plus, you know, 2 dots of violet. This is just an area for you just to experiment in, write things down in. Okay, so let's go on to our yellow green and our blue green. And again, what's going to happen is I've got this pile of green. I'm going to reserve a little bit of it for my complementary opposites mixing later. So I'll scrape a little bit of that out and set it off to the side, just like I did with this orange. Then I'm going to go ahead and get it turned to a yellow green, back to a green, and then into blue green. Okay, there's a pretty nice yellow green. Okay, there it is in my color wheel. I feel like I could have done it slightly more yellow, but again, that's the whole reason we do this, is to see how the paints mix and how they behave. So I'm going to take this now, start adding blue. It'll turn back into green as I do that, and then we're just going to go a little bit further into blue-green territory. Okay, I'm back at green, and before I get too far, I'm going to go ahead and save a little bit of that, like I mentioned before, so we can do our complementary opposites. Here is my blue-green. Pretty close. I think I'm a little bit onto the green side, so I could add just a little bit more blue to this. Okay, there's my blue-green pasted in. Now I'm going to make my blue-violet and my red-violet. I'm actually out of violet, so I'll have to mix up a fresh batch of that and then just make sure I get it really close to my original violet so I don't mess up any of my spectrum. Okay, here's another batch of violet, and I swatched it to check and see. My first attempt was a little too blue, so I added some red to it, and I think we're good now. And then remember, we want to take a little bit of that and set it aside somewhere because we're going to need that for the complementary opposites. And then I'm going to take this and make my red violet and my blue violet. Get those put into my color wheel. Okay, I pasted in my red violet and my blue violet. And just so you can see, there's the indigo that I mixed earlier, and here's my blue violet, so you can see the very slight difference between them. Okay, we've got this whole section completed now. We need to mix complementary opposites. So you might remember from playing with paint as a kid, when you mix complementary opposites, you get a neutral color, and that is our goal here. So the first thing we're going to do is mix red and green. Okay, here's the green I reserved, and I'm going to just start adding a little bit of red at a time. We're going to get to the point with this where it's going to be so precise, and we're adding such a small amount of paint that you might want to actually switch to your brush And in this case, it would be okay to use that for mixing. The goal here is to get a color that doesn't look red or green. You can't detect either color inside this mixture. Okay, so what I've got here is kind of a grayish color, and I can't detect any red or any green in it, so I think we have achieved a balanced neutral. Okay, and there's the result. I think that looks just about perfectly gray. So I'm going to do the same thing for the yellow and violet and the blue and orange. Okay, here's purple and yellow. No trace of purple, no trace of yellow. Has a slightly green tint, probably because the blue is a little bit strong. But I'm pretty happy with this. Okay, here's the results of those complementary opposites. This one ended up slightly green, so I probably had too much yellow in my orange, but I got it as neutral as I could. So what is the point of this? Why do we do this? Why don't we just use black straight out of the bottle? Because black is flat and dead and boring. And when you mix complementary opposites, you get a lot richer colors. And they also retain some characteristics of their original colors. So if you were painting something with a lot of green and you wanted to darken it up, like shadows, you would add red to it, little bits at a time, and then you'd end up with this deep gray color. Same thing with violet and yellow. This is a much prettier dark color to use with those. And orange and blue, like I said, I think I got a little bit too much yellow, but what we've got is a really nice range of neutrals here that we can use for dark areas in paintings that are just much more rich and vibrant than straight black out of the tube. Okay, the last part of your new media test sheet is to fill out this section that's value, tint, and shade. Value is the heaviest pigment to the lightest or most washed out. Tint is a pure pigment plus increasing amounts of white, and shade is pure pigment plus increasing amounts of black. So remember, we grabbed that black and white at the very beginning. Now we finally get to use them. For the first one, which is value, what we want is kind of a dark paint, because if it's too light, this isn't going to show up. I have a bunch of this violet and blue left over, so I'm just going to use that, but I am going to transfer it into a palette. Okay, I've transferred my paint onto a palette, and I'm just going to take some of it in its natural, really thick state and put that in the first square for value. So this is as dark and as pigmented as this particular paint can get. Now what I'm going to do is add increasing amounts of water as we work our way down this value scale. And as I do that, it's going to get more and more washed out till we get to the end. It's going to look like really pale watercolor. The way to do this is to get a separate container with clean water, and you can either drip water from your brush, or I've got my spray bottle, and I'm just going to add a few drops at a time. You'll probably want to test this on a separate sheet of paper to make sure that it's thinning out at the correct rate, because you want a nice even gradation from really dark to really light. Okay, so here's what's happening. There is my darkest pigment, no water added, adding a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more water. I've got 3 more steps to go. By the time I get down here, it'll just look like water that's been slightly stained with paint. And you can see in my palette that the paint is kind of becoming the consistency of watercolor. So I'm just going to keep carefully watering that down. Again, making this really steady gradation. And you can see I've got a little sample paper up here where I'm doing swatches so I can make sure they look right before I put them in. Okay, there's my finished product. These are still wet, so when these dry, the color will be a lot clearer. I feel like I probably could have had a few more steps, like right in here. but that's something that comes with practice. And the point of this is just so that you can see that you can use acrylic straight out of the tube for nice dark coverage. You can also water it down and use it a lot like watercolor. Okay, the next section is tint, and that's pure pigment plus increasing amounts of white. So again, for this section, we're going to want a dark color because as we're adding white, it's going to fade out. If you start with too light of a color, that is just not going to be very obvious. So start with something dark, any kind of dark color you want, and then we'll start adding white to that. Okay, here's the nice blue-green that I had. So I'm going to start with that, start adding white. Probably because we're going to be doing this in some pretty small batches, it's okay to grab the white with your paintbrush rather than use the palette knife for mixing, because we're just going to do a really small area of this. And we just want to get it like a couple degrees lighter than we started with. And again, you might want to test this on a separate sheet of paper just to make sure it's the color you want. But that's a good first step. If this is undiluted and this is with that little smidgen of white, that's pretty good. So I'll get that on the paper and I'll do a few of those and show you what it looks like. Okay, so here's my first 4 steps of tint. You can see we're getting lighter and lighter as we add more white paint. By the time we get to this, it should look almost like the white of the page with just a little bit of that color in it. There's no formula for doing this. I can't tell you start with a teaspoon of green and then add 1/8 of a teaspoon each time you go down the line, because every paint is going to be different, every mixture, every formulation. You just have to use your eyes and a test sheet and kind of let that guide you. Okay, here's my finished product. Obviously, you could do this a lot more gradually. You could have, 50 variations before you get from darkest to lightest. I'm not even sure if you can see my lightest. It's like just the slightest hint of color. Okay, the last thing we're going to do is shade. So for this, we want pure pigment plus increasing amounts of black. So we're going to start with something kind of light, a yellow or a white, maybe even an orange or a lime green, a yellow green would work. And then you're just going to start adding little bits of black as you go down. So same thing we just did, but instead of adding small amounts of white, we're adding small amounts of black. Okay, here's what I've so far. I started with some red orange that I had left over, and I'm adding just the smallest dots of black to it. It's easy to go too far with this, so just move really slowly. Okay, and here is my finished shade series. This probably looks black on camera, but there's just the tiniest little hint of orange to it, just enough to soften it up so that it's not completely black. So your new media test sheet should look something like this. This is the one for acrylic. We handle oil paint and watercolor and other media in a slightly different fashion, but yours should look something like this.